doggone minute there, you. That's new United States mail.
You heard what the fellow said.
The first cartoon in American television history to win an Emmy Award is not The Simpsons. It is not Looney Tunes. It is not any show that a person under 50 would recognize by name without being prompted. It is the Huckleberry Hound Show, which won the Emmy for Outstanding Achievement in the field of children's programming in 1960, and which most people alive today could not describe in any detail if their life depended on it. That is the specific and genuine paradox at the center of Huckleberry Hound's story. The show that proved animated television could be taken seriously by the institutions that decide what serious means has itself been forgotten so completely that the proof has vanished along with the thing it proved. Huckleberry Hound changed American animation permanently and invisibly, and the invisibility is the most interesting part of what happened to him. This is that story. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. In 1957, William Hanna and Joseph Barbera were 50 years old and unemployed. MGM had shut down its animation department, and the two men who had spent 17 years creating Tom and Jerry, who had won 7 Academy Awards for those cartoons, were standing outside the gates of a studio that no longer needed them, with a combined century of professional animation experience and nowhere to apply it. The logical response to that situation was despair. Hanna and Barbera responded with a production company. They had noticed something that the major animation studios had collectively decided to ignore. Television was producing an insatiable demand for content that the existing supply of theatrical cartoons could not satisfy. Networks needed programming every day. Theatrical animation had been produced at a rate of 1 short per month per studio. The economics of theatrical animation, thousands of drawings per minute of finished film produced by large teams of specialized artists, made it impossible to produce content at the volume television required at a price television could afford. Hanna and Barbera's solution was limited animation, and the solution was so obvious in retrospect that the only interesting question is why nobody else had implemented it first. Instead of animating every element of every frame, they identified which elements needed to move for a given action and animated only those elements while holding everything else static. A character speaking did not require the entire body to be redrawn for every frame. The mouth moved, the eyes might shift, the body held. The background never moved unless the camera moved. The technique reduced the drawing requirement per minute of finished film by a factor that made television animation economically viable, and it produced a visual style that critics from the theatrical tradition immediately identified as inferior, and that the television audience immediately accepted as normal because television was itself a new medium with no established aesthetic standard against which the animation could be measured as lacking. The Huckleberry Hound Show, which premiered on syndicated television in October 1958, was the second Hanna-Barbera series, but it was the first to demonstrate the full creative potential of what the studio was capable of within the format they had developed. Huckleberry Hound himself was a blue dog with a southern accent who moved through a different occupation and a different situation in each episode with the same unflappable calm regardless of what was happening around him. He had been a sheriff and a firefighter and a lion tamer and a painter and a French foreign legionnaire and a deep-sea diver, and in each of these occupations he had encountered disaster with the same equanimity and the same mild confusion and the same complete absence of the anxiety that the disaster objectively warranted. The disaster always resolved itself. Huck was always fine. The calm was not stupidity. It was a philosophical position that the show never stated explicitly, because stating it explicitly would have ruined it. Daws Butler voiced Huckleberry Hound, and the voice he created for the character was one of the defining performances in the history of American animation. Butler based the voice on a combination of Southern American speech patterns and a specific quality of gentle unhurriedness that communicated that Huck was operating at a pace the universe had not established and could not accelerate. When disaster struck Huck, he registered it with the specific verbal rhythm of a person who had decided in advance that whatever happened was going to be fine because he had already been through everything and come out the other side, and nothing the universe had subsequently offered had changed that fundamental assessment. The voice was warm without being sentimental. It was calm without being passive. It was funny in the way that genuine equanimity is funny when it persists in the face of evidence that equanimity is the wrong response to the current situation. Butler held all of these qualities simultaneously across hundreds of episodes without the performance ever becoming habit rather than choice, and that consistency was a technical achievement that deserves more recognition than it has received. The show's format was an anthology within a single episode. Each Huckleberry Hound episode contained the Huck segment alongside 2 additional cartoon series that rotated through the program. Pixie and Dixie and Mr. Jinx featured 2 mice and a cat whose dynamic inverted the conventional predator-prey relationship of the Tom and Jerry tradition by making the cat simultaneously more intelligent than his prey and consistently less successful at catching them. Yogi Bear appeared in the Huck Show before receiving his own series, and his segments were the ones that most clearly demonstrated the difference between the 2 characters as comic archetypes. Yogi schemed. Huck endured. Yogi believed in his own intelligence. Huck had no particular opinion about his intelligence one way or another. Yogi's comedy was about the gap between ambition and capability. Huck's comedy was about the absence of that gap because Huck had no ambition that could create it. The contrast was not incidental to the show's design. It was the design. Hanna and Barbera understood that different kinds of comedy required different kinds of comic protagonists, and they populated their shows accordingly. The Emmy Award that the Huckleberry Hound Show received in 1960 was significant not primarily as a recognition of quality, but as an institutional statement about what animation could be. The Television Academy giving an Emmy to an animated series produced for television at a budget that theatrical animation would have considered insulting was the establishment acknowledging that the new form Hanna and Barbera had created was legitimate. The acknowledgement mattered because institutional legitimacy in the entertainment industry is not simply honorary. It affects what gets made and what gets funded and what gets taken seriously in development meetings and what kinds of creative risks producers are willing to take with their budgets. Before the Emmy, animated television was children's programming. After the Emmy, animated television was something the Television Academy had decided deserved to be evaluated by the same standards it applied to everything else. That distinction was the door that every subsequent animated television series of ambition has walked through. Huckleberry Hound opened it by being undeniably good at exactly the moment when the institution needed something to be undeniably good in order to justify paying attention. The specific quality that earned that recognition, and that has been most consistently undervalued in retrospect, was the writing. The scripts for Huckleberry Hound were produced by a rotating staff that included Warren Foster and Michael Maltese, who had both come from the Warner Bros. Animation department, where they had written for Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Porky Pig and Tweety and Sylvester during the golden age of Looney Tunes. The significance of their arrival at Hanna-Barbera is difficult to overstate, and has been consistently understated in the historical record that tends to focus on Hanna and Barbera themselves as the primary creative forces in everything the studio produced. Foster and Maltese were not support staff. They were the people who had made the greatest theatrical animation of the 1940s and 1950s as funny as it was, and they brought to Hanna-Barbera a discipline of joke construction and character consistency that elevated the limited animation format beyond what the format itself could have supported without them. A joke in a Huckleberry Hound episode was structured with the precision that Foster and Maltese had developed across decades of theatrical short filmmaking, and the precision was visible even when the animation delivering the joke was operating at the minimum level the budget allowed. The jokes worked because the writing was good enough to work regardless of the animation, and the animation was good enough to deliver what the writing required without calling attention to its own limitations. This combination, great writing accepting the constraints of a modest production and modest production elevated by the quality of what it was delivering, is the specific formula that made the show work, and it required both elements to be present simultaneously. Remove the writing quality and you have cheap animation with cheap jokes. Remove the animation budget constraint and you have expensive theatrical production that cannot sustain a television schedule. The combination was the thing, and the combination required the specific people who happened to be in the room at the specific moment when Hanna-Barbera was building the show. The character who most clearly reveals what was lost when Huckleberry Hound faded from cultural consciousness is Huck himself rather than any of the supporting characters or spin-offs. Huck represented a comic archetype that American popular culture has had genuine difficulty sustaining since the show ended its original run. The person who is genuinely at peace with whatever is happening to them is not a common figure in comedy because comedy typically requires anxiety and conflict and the gap between what a character wants and what they are getting. Huck had none of these things in the conventional sense. He did not particularly want anything and therefore could not be denied what he wanted and therefore had no conventional comic engine driving him. What drove Huck was something more interesting and more difficult to maintain across a long run of episodes. He was moved by the simple fact of situations presenting themselves and requiring a response. He responded to each situation with complete commitment and no attachment to outcome, and the comedy emerged not from his failure to get what he wanted, but from the contrast between his absolute commitment and the absolute indifference of the universe to his commitment. He was going to sing "Oh My Darling Clementine," and the universe was going to put a lion in front of him, and he was going to deal with the lion, and then he was going to continue with Clementine. The song was always going to continue. That was not optimism. That was something beyond optimism that the show never named, because naming it would have been smaller than living it across 200 episodes of a blue dog in different hats. The commercial success that followed the Emmy and the critical attention was immediate and genuine, and demonstrated that the audience Hanna-Barbera had built was not simply tolerating the show as background noise for Saturday mornings, but was actively invested in the characters in ways that drove purchasing behavior. The Huckleberry Hound merchandise that appeared in the years following the show's premiere covered every category that children's licensing had developed, and several it had not yet fully explored. Huck appeared on lunch boxes and coloring books and board games and stuffed animals and pajamas and cereal boxes and school supplies, and the sales figures across these categories confirmed what the ratings had already suggested. Children in America in 1959 and 1960 recognized Huckleberry Hound the way they recognized their own neighbors. He was simply present in the landscape of childhood in those years, in the way that genuinely iconic characters become present, not through deliberate penetration of every available surface, but through the organic spread of something that people want more of because the original encounter with it produced something worth repeating. The blue dog in the pork pie hat was everywhere because children wanted him everywhere, and the adults around those children were willing to spend money to put him there. That level of market penetration was not inevitable and was not guaranteed by the quality of the show alone. It required the quality of the show to have produced the kind of genuine affection that turns audience members into advocates and advocates into consumers. Huckleberry Hound produced that affection more completely and more durably than any animated character television had yet created, and the commercial record of the early 1960s reflects that production precisely. The syndication model that Hanna-Barbera used to distribute the show was itself a significant innovation in how animated content reached its audience, and the innovation had consequences that extended far beyond the show itself. Rather than selling the series to a single network for national broadcast, Hanna-Barbera sold the show directly to individual television stations across the country who could schedule it according to their own programming needs. This syndication approach gave the studio more control over how the show was presented and more revenue per episode than a network deal would have produced, but it also meant that Huckleberry Hound aired at different times in different markets and was therefore watched by different audiences in different contexts. In some markets, it was a late afternoon show aimed at children returning from school. In others, it was an early evening show that families watched together after dinner. The flexibility of the syndication model meant that the show found its audience wherever that audience was rather than requiring the audience to find it at a fixed time on a fixed network, and the finding happened more completely and more organically than a network deal would have allowed. Hanna-Barbera understood something about how television distribution worked that the major studios who were still thinking about content in theatrical terms had not yet grasped. The show that was available was the show that got watched, and the show that got watched was the show that built the audience, that built the brand, that built the empire. Huckleberry Hound was the first domino in that sequence, and the sequence produced everything that followed. Yogi Bear had his own show and his own movie and his own misguided space-themed revival that demonstrated everything wrong about how corporations manage inherited creative properties. The Flintstones became a feature film franchise and a vitamin brand embedded permanently in American cultural consciousness. Scooby-Doo never stopped appearing in new formats because the mystery-solving structure had enough flexibility to absorb adaptation without losing its essential identity. Huck had none of these advantages, and the reason he had none of them returns to the specific quality that had made him work in the first place. His equanimity was not a format that could be moved into new settings while remaining recognizable. It was a character state that required its original conditions to function. Put Huck in space, and you do not have Huck in space. You have a blue dog in space who happens to share a name with a character whose comedy depended entirely on the specific friction between his calm and the specific world he inhabited. Huck simply faded. Not through mismanagement in the way that other properties were mismanaged. Not through a specific catastrophic decision. Simply through the accumulation of time and the shift in cultural attention toward properties that were louder and more urgent and more willing to demand attention rather than simply offering it to whoever happened to be present. The deeper reason for Huck's fading is harder to name but more interesting to think about. The comic archetype he represented, genuine equanimity in the face of persistent difficulty, is not one that the culture of any particular era has found easy to sustain interest in for extended periods. It requires the audience to be comfortable with a protagonist who does not want anything badly enough to create the tension that narrative traditionally requires. Huck's calm was the whole point, and the whole point was also the limitation that made him difficult to sustain across decades of changing audience expectations. By the time children's animation had evolved into the faster and louder and more conflict-driven format that Saturday morning television established in the 1970s, Huck's specific quality had no context in which to operate. He was not slow, he was deliberate. But deliberate reads as slow when the format surrounding it has accelerated beyond the pace at which deliberate is legible as a choice rather than a failure of energy. What Huckleberry Hound left behind is not nothing despite the forgetting. Every animated series that has subsequently built its comedy around a protagonist of genuine, unflappable calm, and there have been several across the decades since the show ended its original run, is working in a tradition that Huck established. The specific comic register of a character who is fine regardless of what is happening is not a tradition that originated with Huckleberry Hound, but it was Huckleberry Hound who demonstrated that it could sustain a television series across multiple seasons and earn institutional recognition from an industry that had not previously taken animation seriously enough to offer that recognition. That demonstration was the contribution. It was made once and it did not need to be made again. The door was open. The dog who opened it walked through to the other side and kept walking at exactly the pace that suited him regardless of whether anyone was watching. That was always going to be the ending. It could not have been any other way. Huck would not have wanted it any other way. He would not have wanted anything in particular. He would have been fine either way, and the fineness would have been genuine, and the genuineness is what the forgetting cannot touch.